The courthouse doors slammed open so hard the hinges screamed, and Celia Callahan stood at the top of the steps with a rifle in one hand and a folded land deed in the other, her red hair whipping wild in the Wyoming wind, staring down at the man who had just declared to half of Dusthaven that she was a fraud, a runaway, and legally nobody. Vernon Bristol did not flinch. He stood in the packed dirt street below those courthouse steps with his hat pushed back on his dark head, his jaw tight as iron, his gray eyes burning with something that was not anger alone. It was a forced choice, and she could see he already knew it. 47 people stood around him in a loose crescent, and every single one of them was listening. The county clerk, Mr. Aldous Fenn, stood in the doorway behind Celia with a quill still dripping ink, and the document she had just snatched from his hands fluttered at its edges like it wanted to run too. "You put your name on that deed this morning," Harlan Greer called up from the street. He was Vernon's cousin, and everything about him was expensive and dishonest, from his polished boots to the lawyer he had imported from Cheyenne. And the law in this territory states that a single man cannot hold a land deed of more than 300 acres without a lawful wife recorded in the county register. You have no wife, Vernon, you never filed. So that land, every acre of Redbone Creek, reverts to blood family. That means me. Vernon's hand moved, slow and deliberate, away from the iron at his hip, not reaching for it, refusing to. Even now, even with everything crumbling, he would not be the man who pulled iron in a crowd. That restraint, Celia would later decide, was the first thing she truly respected about him. But she did not know him yet. Not really. She had arrived in Dusthaven 48 hours ago, a woman with a fast horse, a sharper mind, a darker past, and absolutely no intention of stopping. She needed to understand how she had arrived at this exact moment, standing on courthouse steps holding another man's deed, because the answer to that question was the answer to everything that came after. 3 days before the courthouse steps, Celia Callahan had ridden into Dusthaven, Wyoming territory, in October of 1882, on a bay mare named Prudence, who was significantly smarter than most people Celia had met in the last 2 years of running west. She had started in Ohio. She had reasons. Those reasons were buried now under the flat Kansas land she had passed through without stopping. Under the Colorado mountain passes, she had crossed alone in September when the first snow came early and the trail guides all turned back. She had not turned back. She had mapped the pass herself, using a surveying kit she had carried in her saddlebags since she left a cartography position at the United States Geological Survey office in Columbus, where she had worked under a man named Dr. Pieter Voss, who had taken every map she drew and put his own name on it. That was the dark past, the secret she carried. Not a crime, nothing lurid, just a wound that ran deep as a creek in dry season. The kind of wound that does not bleed visibly but poisons everything you drink. She was 27 years old, educated in ways the frontier rarely saw in women, and she had a talent for reading land that bordered on the supernatural. She could look at a hillside and tell you where the water table sat. She could read soil composition by color and texture and know what would grow and what would die. She could triangulate her position using a compass, a watch, and the angle of sunlight, and she had done it in blizzard conditions and been accurate to within 100 yards. The Geological Survey had sent her west on a field assignment in 1880, and when she returned with notebooks full of original survey data on the Green River Basin, Voss had published them as his own work, citing her only as a clerical assistant. She had tried the proper channels. She had written to the survey director. She had documented everything. And then the director had written back a letter so polite and so final that it made her feel as though she were already dead, already erased, already nobody, which was, she realized later, the first time anyone had called her that. Nobody. It would not be the last, so she ran. Not because she was weak, because she was strategic. A woman fighting that particular war, in that particular era, needed ground that had not already been decided against her. She was looking for a place where her skills mattered more than her name, where the land itself would vouch for her if nothing else would. She had heard about Dusthaven from a woman in Laramie who ran a boarding house and knew everything. The woman had told her there was a cartographer's position opening at the Territorial Land Office in Dusthaven, that the county needed someone to survey and record the Redbone Creek Basin before winter set in completely, because the basin was disputed and the courts needed accurate maps. She had told Celia that whoever did the survey would be paid in cash and given first consideration for permanent hire. Celia had ridden hard from Laramie and arrived in Dusthaven on a Tuesday, covered in trail dust, carrying her surveying kit and her rifles, plural, because she carried two, and she was accurate with both. She had stabled Prudence at the livery run by an old Shoshone man named Joseph Runsfar, who looked at her surveying equipment with the calm recognition of someone who understood what it was, and then looked at her with something very close to respect. "You here for the Redbone survey?" he asked. "If they will hire me," she said. "They will hire anyone who can do it," he said. 3 men tried and came back early. The basin floods in October and the benchmarks move. She told him the benchmarks did not actually move, that they only appeared to because the surrounding soil shifted with the seasonal water table fluctuations, and that if you accounted for the hydrological patterns properly, you could still triangulate accurate fixed points. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "You should talk to Vernon Bristol." She asked who Vernon Bristol was. "The man who needs that survey done more than anyone," Joseph said. She found Vernon Bristol at his ranch, 5 miles north of Dusthaven on the edge of the basin, not at the main house but out in the far eastern pasture, where a section of fence had collapsed into a drainage gully. He was alone, which she noted, because a rancher of his acreage usually kept hands. He was driving fence posts by hand with a steel driver, setting each one with 2 precise strikes, and moving to the next with an efficiency that suggested he had done this 10,000 times. He was tall, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders in a way that was entirely functional rather than ornamental, wearing a canvas work coat that had been repaired at both elbows and boots that were good quality but very old. He was 29 years old, though she did not know that yet. He heard Prudence coming and turned without startling, which she also noted. A man who did not startle at an unexpected approach was either very confident or very dangerous, and the particular quality of his stillness suggested the former. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "Depends who is asking," he said. "Not rude, careful. Celia Callahan. I arrived this morning from Laramie. I am applying for the Redbone Creek survey contract through the Territorial Land Office." He looked at her for a moment, at the surveying kit, at the rifle across her saddle, at her hands, which was unusual. Most men looked at her face and stopped there, cataloging her either as a threat or an object. Vernon Bristol looked at her hands. "You know hydrographic surveying," he said. "I worked at the United States Geological Survey in Columbus," she said. 3 years of field work and 2 years of office. I surveyed the Green River Basin in 1880. His eyes changed. Not dramatically, nothing theatrical, just a shift in the quality of his attention. "The Green River Survey." "The one published by Voss in 81. Something cold moved through her chest. "Yes," she said, "that one." He said nothing for a moment, and she braced herself for the comment that always came, the polite version of the erasure. Instead he said, "The basin elevation profiles in that report were extraordinary, better than anything the survey had published in a decade." She did not know what to do with that. She covered it with practicality. "Mr. Bristol, I understand you have an interest in the Redbone Creek survey results. I would like to hear what you need specifically, because I suspect what the county office wants and what you need may be different things, and it would help me to understand the full picture before I begin." He set down his fence post driver. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were more perceptive than she had expected. "Come up to the house," he said. "I will explain." The house was plain and honest. Nothing wasted, nothing neglected. A stone fireplace, a kitchen table of rough pine that was nonetheless perfectly level, a bookshelf that held a mixed and surprising collection ranging from ranching manuals to Dickens, to a geological survey handbook that was the same edition she owned. A good house. A lonely house, though she could not have said exactly how she knew that. Vernon Bristol made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, which she approved of, and sat across from her at the table and told her the truth, which was something she had not expected and which unbalanced her slightly. He told her that his father, James Bristol, had homesteaded the Redbone Creek parcel in 1869, had built it from raw land to a working cattle ranch of 800 acres, and had died of a fever in the summer of 1881, leaving the deed to Vernon. The deed had a provision attached, a restriction his father had added at the insistence of the original county recorder, an old territorial law designed to prevent land speculation by single men, requiring that a deed of over 300 acres be held by a married man or a family unit, a law that had largely been ignored for years but which Harlan Greer, Vernon's cousin and the son of James Bristol's estranged brother, had now hired a Cheyenne lawyer to enforce. Harlan wanted the land. The land was worth considerably more than it had been in 1869 because of the Redbone Creek water rights, which had become extraordinarily valuable as the railroad pushed through and the surrounding territory developed. Harlan had filed a contestation in Dusthaven County Court, scheduled for November 15th, less than 5 weeks away. Vernon told her all of this without asking for her sympathy, which she noticed. He stated it as fact, the way she stated survey data. The court is going to want a certified survey of the property boundaries, he said. Because Harlan's lawyer is also arguing that the original homestead claim was improperly bounded, that my father's 1869 survey was inaccurate, and that the actual parcel may be smaller than recorded, which would put it under the 300-acre threshold anyway and render the marital restriction moot in a different way. If he can prove the parcel is under 300 acres, the restriction does not apply, but neither does my deed, because my father filed for the larger parcel. It is a trap designed from two sides. She was already thinking about the surveying problem, turning it over in her mind with the particular focused pleasure of a puzzle that had real stakes. Was the original survey conducted? 1869, July. The creek was high from snowmelt, and the boundaries were benchmarked from the creek bed, as far as I know. Then the original survey is very likely inaccurate by several degrees, she said. A creek bed in July snowmelt conditions is not the same creek bed in October. The channel migrates, but that does not necessarily mean the parcel is smaller. It may mean it is larger, depending on which direction the channel has moved. He looked at her with that shift in his attention again, more pronounced this time. You know this from existing surveys. I know it from hydrology, she said. Mr. Bristol, I can conduct this survey, but I need full access to the property, including the water boundaries, and I need whatever documentation your father left about the original filing, and I need to understand something. She paused, and this was the part that required care. The county office is paying for the survey, but you have a personal stake in the result. I want to be very clear with you. I will record what the land shows me. I will not adjust the measurements to serve any particular outcome. If the land is smaller than your father claimed, I will report that. Do you understand? He held her gaze. I understand, he said. And I am hiring you because I believe the land will show what I know to be true. I am not asking you to lie. I am asking you to look. She believed him. That was the troubling part. After 2 years of running from a man who had lied to her with a face just as open and honest as this one, she believed Vernon Bristol without being able to entirely explain why, and that belief made her more careful, not less. She began the survey the following morning. Vernon gave her the original filing documents, a rough hand-drawn map from 1869 that was, as she had suspected, charitably optimistic in its precision, and free access to every corner of the property. He did not hover. He did not question her methods. He brought her coffee in a tin can at mid-morning when she was working the eastern benchmarks, set it on a flat rock near where she was working, said nothing, and went back to his own work. She drank it without stopping what she was doing. By afternoon of the first survey day, she had already established something important. The original 1869 benchmark on the southern boundary had been set from a large flat rock formation near the creek, and she found that rock. What the 1869 surveyor had not accounted for was a significant bend in the creek channel that had existed in 1869, but had been straightened by a natural flood event sometime in the 1870s, which meant the channel now ran several hundred feet further east than it had when the original filing was made. If the parcel boundary was legally defined as following the creek, and the creek had moved east, then the parcel was larger than originally recorded, not smaller. It was beautiful in its irony. Harlan Greer's lawyers were planning to argue the parcel had shrunk. The truth was the opposite. She did not tell Vernon yet. She needed to verify. She worked until the light failed completely, mapping by feel in the last 20 minutes with her compass and the watch she kept wound to the second, and she went back to Dusthaven and ate dinner alone at the hotel and sat with her notebooks until nearly midnight running calculations. The second day, she verified. The parcel was 831 acres by accurate measurement, more than she had originally estimated. The water rights were unambiguous. And there was something else she found in the back of Vernon's father's filing documents, something that changed the nature of the legal problem considerably. James Bristol had anticipated the marital restriction issue. In 1874, when territorial law had been tightened and the restriction enforcement had been briefly energized, James Bristol had made a filing with the county recorder that constituted a form of familial deed trust, placing the land in trust for his direct male heir, a legal instrument that predated Harlan's contestation by 8 years. The document was obscure. It was buried in the filing records under a secondary reference number. But it was legal and it was recorded, and it meant that even if the marital restriction applied to Vernon as a single man, the trust instrument provided an alternative legal pathway for ownership. She brought both findings to Vernon the second evening, spreading her notebooks and the filing documents across his kitchen table while the fire burned, and the wind started to pick up outside in the way it did in Wyoming in October, as though the weather wanted to remind everyone of its jurisdiction. Vernon looked at the survey calculations first. He was quiet for a long time, following her notation, and she could see him understanding it. Not performing understanding, but actually working through the numbers with a landowner's knowledge of the terrain. When he reached the conclusion about the Eastern Channel migration, he looked up at her, and there it was, the thing she had not quite been prepared for, the complete and genuine shock on his face. "It is larger," he said. "By 31 acres, she said. And the water rights follow the current channel, not the 1869 channel, because water rights in territorial law attach to the physical water source, not to a historical map. Your water rights have actually expanded." He sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment, and the expression on his face was not triumph exactly. It was something more complicated. It was a man who had been afraid for months suddenly given permission to believe the fear might have been premature, and watching him process it was unexpectedly affecting. "The trust document," she said, and pushed it toward him. "Your father filed a familial deed trust in 1874. Did you know about this?" He looked at it. His jaw tightened. "No," he said very quietly. "Did you know your father anticipated this problem? He never said so." There was something raw in his voice then, briefly, the tone of a man who had spent more than a year mourning a father and discovering him more fully in the aftermath. He was not a man who explained his preparations. He just prepared. She gave him a moment. She had learned in 2 years of running that some silences required you to sit in them instead of filling them, and she had learned it by making the mistake of filling them too early too many times. "This changes the legal situation significantly," she said, after the silence had done what it needed to do. It does not eliminate the risk. Harlan's lawyer will challenge the trust instrument's validity, probably on procedural grounds, and you will need a lawyer of your own. But the survey results alone make his core argument much weaker, and the trust document gives you a second line of defense. Vernon looked at her across the table in the firelight and said, "Celia, what do I owe you?" She had not told him her first name. He had picked it up somewhere, from Joseph at the livery probably, or from the hotel register. It landed differently than she expected, hearing it in his voice in this room. "The county survey contract rate," she said, "whatever the land office is paying." "That is not what I mean," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "I know what you mean," she said, "but I am not going to negotiate that tonight. Let us get through the legal situation first." She went back to the hotel and lay awake for a long time, which was not entirely about the legal calculations. The situation accelerated the next morning, which was when things stopped being purely professional and started being something else entirely. Celia arrived at the county land office when it opened to file her preliminary survey report, which was standard procedure, a public record that would establish the benchmark data before the court date. She was in the middle of handing her documentation to the clerk, Aldous Fenn, when Harlan Greer walked in with his Cheyenne lawyer, a thin-shouldered man named Prescott who had the particular air of someone who charged by the hour and had arranged things to require many hours. Prescott looked at her survey documents and then at her, and then at Fenn and said, "Who authorized a woman to conduct this survey?" Fenn, to his credit, said, "The county survey contract does not specify gender." Prescott said, "I would like to examine her credentials." Celia handed him her USGS certification, her field survey licenses, and her letter of recommendation from the survey office in Columbus, which she had kept even though it was signed by Voss, and therefore contained the particular poison of his name, because credentials were credentials even when the system that produced them was corrupt. Prescott looked at these documents for some time. Then he said something that was meant to be devastating, delivered in the measured tone of a man who had rehearsed it. He said that there was a sworn statement from Dr. Pieter Voss of the United States Geological Survey attesting that Celia Callahan had been employed in a clerical capacity only, that she possessed no independent survey certification, and that any work produced under her name was technically the property of the survey, produced under her employment there, and therefore any claim she made to professional survey credentials was potentially fraudulent. The room went very still. Celia's hands did not shake. She had known this was possible. She had known Voss had contacts throughout the territorial survey system. She had not known he had reached this far west, but she should have assumed it, and the fact that she had not assumed it meant she had been running so fast she had stopped thinking ahead, which was unlike her and which needed to stop immediately. She was thinking through her options with the rapid, layered precision that was her most reliable tool when the door opened and Vernon Bristol walked in. He had not been summoned. He was simply a man who paid attention to his surroundings, and he had heard from Joseph that morning that Harlan Greer had arrived at the courthouse early, and he had come to see why. He stood in the doorway of the land office and took in the room in a single sweep, and whatever he read in Celia's face and in the configuration of people around her told him enough. "What is happening?" he said, quiet, even, the voice of a man who did not need to be loud to be heard. Prescott turned to him with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a larger audience. He repeated the accusation. He added, for good measure, that a survey conducted by an uncredentialed individual would not be admissible in the county court proceedings, and that therefore Vernon's legal position was no stronger than it had been before Miss Callahan's arrival, and that the court date stood. That was the moment, the forced choice, the trap that had been designed from two sides. If Celia's credentials were successfully challenged, the survey was inadmissible, and if Vernon had no admissible survey and no recorded wife, the deed contestation would likely succeed. Harlan Greer, who had been quiet in the corner until now, stepped forward and said the thing that was meant to be the killing blow. He said that if Vernon could not produce a legally recognized wife by the time of the court proceedings on November 15th, and if the survey was inadmissible, then the court would have no basis to deny the contestation, and the land would revert to family claim. He said the word family the way certain men said it, like a weapon dressed up as a gift. Vernon looked at Harlan for a long moment. Then he looked at Celia. And that was when she took the deed from Fenn's desk, the filed copy of the original homestead document, and walked out the door with it, which was how she ended up at the top of the courthouse steps with a rifle in one hand and a land deed in the other, facing down an entire street full of Dusthaven, Wyoming, and a man named Vernon Bristol who was looking up at her with gray eyes that held something she was not yet ready to name. The immediate crisis resolved itself in a way she had not predicted, which was also unlike her. Vernon did not do what Harlan expected, which was capitulate or bluster or reach for his gun. Instead, he turned to the crowd and said, in that same quiet, carrying voice, "I would like to speak with Miss Callahan privately. I believe we have the basis for an arrangement that will satisfy the legal requirements before any court proceedings are necessary." The crowd did not disperse so much as redistribute, pulling back into a watching circle that gave them a bubble of near privacy in the middle of the street. Harlan's lawyer began to object, and Vernon looked at him with a patience that was more unsettling than anger and said, "You will have your court date. The law allows me until November 15th. Nothing here changes that." Celia came down the courthouse steps slowly because she was thinking, and she needed the length of those steps to finish the thought before she reached the bottom. She handed the deed back to Fenn when she reached the door, because she had not actually meant to keep it. She had taken it to disrupt the momentum of the moment, to create a pause, and she had done that. Vernon met her at the bottom of the steps. He was close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw and the careful, controlled way he was breathing, the signs of a man managing something very large very quietly. "Walk with me," he said. They walked, down the main street and around the back of the mercantile, where the noise of the street dropped enough that they could hear themselves properly, and where the October wind came straight off the basin and smelled like cold water and sage and the specific emptiness of high country. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you answer." "All right," she said. "I need a wife," he said, "legally recorded before November 15th. That is the fact of the situation, and I will not dress it up as anything other than what it is. I know you are a woman who does not run from facts." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "I also know," he said, "that you are running from something that followed you here. That statement Prescott produced from Voss was not a coincidence. Someone sent for it. Harlan has been looking for ways to undermine anyone who might help me, and he found the thing that followed you from Ohio, and he used it. Which means you have a problem that is not going to disappear when you ride out of Dusthaven. It will be waiting for you in the next town and the one after that." She said nothing because he was right and she was not going to argue with correct information. "What I am proposing," he said, "is a legal marriage, witnessed and recorded before November 15th. It solves my legal problem, and what I can offer you in return is this." He paused and looked out at the basin for a moment, at the gray-blue sky over the Redbone Creek flats. "I will spend every resource I have to document and prove what Voss did. I know people in the territorial government. I know the land commissioner in Cheyenne personally, because he filed against a Greer claim 5 years ago and I helped him, and he owes me a debt. If Voss submitted a fraudulent affidavit to a territorial court proceeding, that is a federal matter, not just a professional dispute. It can be prosecuted, and if it is prosecuted, your credentials are restored publicly in a way that cannot be erased." She stood very still. "You would do that," she said, not a question, a careful calibration. "I would do that," he said, "because what was done to you is wrong. That is not sentiment, that is just fact. The same way the survey results are fact." The wind moved between them. She looked at him and tried to find the angle, the hidden motive, the trap inside the offer, because there was always a trap. She had learned that. She was very good at finding traps. She turned this one over and examined every surface and found, which was alarming, that it appeared to be what it said it was. "You are proposing a business arrangement," she said. "I am proposing a legal arrangement," he said carefully. "What it becomes after that is not something I can predict or promise. I will not pretend to you. I think you are extraordinary. I am trying very hard not to let that interfere with making you a fair offer." There it was, the honest thing, the thing she did not know what to do with. "I need to think," she said. "You have until tonight," he said. "Harlan's lawyer will file additional motions in the morning." She went back to the hotel and sat at the window with her notebooks open in front of her. But she was not looking at the notebooks. She was looking at the basin, the flat expanse of Redbone Creek country that she had spent 2 days mapping and which she now understood intimately. The way she understood things she spent time with properly, the water table under it and the soil composition, and the way the channel breathed with the seasons. She thought about running. She always thought about running. It was the first option she evaluated now, reflexively, the way you check the exit when you walk into a room. She could ride out tonight and be past the Wyoming border by morning. But he had said the right thing, and she was honest enough to know it. The Voss problem would not disappear. It had already reached Wyoming. It would reach wherever she went next, because Voss had federal connections and she was a woman who had made an enemy of a man with federal connections. And the only way to end that was to fight it from a position of legal standing and documented evidence, not from the back of a fast horse in the dark. She thought about Vernon Bristol standing in the street below the courthouse steps, the way he had not reached for his gun, the survey handbook on his shelf, the way he had looked at her hands. The coffee left on a flat rock without a word. She went to his ranch at dusk. He was on the porch when she rode up, as though he had been expecting her to come either way, prepared to receive either answer with the same steadiness. She dismounted without speaking and tied Prudence to the porch rail and stood at the foot of the steps looking up at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded once slowly. "All right." "There are conditions," she said. "Name them." "I will continue working," she said. "The survey and whatever else I choose to take on. This does not end my independence." "I would not want it to," he said. "The ranch needs a permanent, accurate survey of its own. I have needed one for 2 years. I am hoping you might find time for it eventually." She looked at him. "You planned that," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I thought ahead," he said. "My father's habit." She felt something shift in her chest, small but definite, like a creek channel moving after a flood. "I have a second condition," she said. "Regarding Voss, I want to be involved in whatever action is taken, not informed of it afterward, involved in it from the beginning." "Of course," he said. "And a third," she said, and this was the hard one. "I will not be asked to pretend to feelings I do not yet have. If this arrangement changes, if something develops between us, it must develop honestly and without either of us performing a fiction for the benefit of social appearance." He held her gaze for a long, serious moment. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I have lived on this land alone for 4 years, and I have never in that time wanted company for its own sake. What I feel when I am around you is not something I plan to manufacture or perform. You have my word on that." She believed him. That alarmed her. They rode to Dusthaven the next morning and stood before the county justice of the peace, a weathered man named Samuel Cord, who had been performing frontier marriages for 15 years, and who did not blink at the businesslike nature of the proceedings. Joseph Runsfar served as witness, which he did with a quiet dignity that suggested he had known this was coming before either of them had. Aldous Fenn, the county clerk, was the second witness, and he recorded the marriage in the county register with a precision that was entirely in his professional character. The ceremony was plain and fast, because neither of them was prone to ceremony. When Justice Cord reached the traditional closing, Vernon looked at her, and she was close enough to see that the steadiness in his face was real, not performed. the stillness of a man who had decided something important and was at peace with the decision. She felt her own steadiness, which had never been the same as peace, more of an armed neutrality, and she wondered briefly, looking at his face, whether the two things could coexist. He kissed her at the end of it because Justice Cord asked him to, and it was brief and formal, and yet the particular warmth of his mouth against her cheek in the cold October morning stayed with her through the ride back to the ranch in a way that was difficult to annotate. The ranch had a second bedroom. He showed it to her without comment, had clearly prepared it, the sheets clean and the window latch fixed, and a small table by the bed where her notebooks would have room. She stood in the doorway of it and felt something complicated that she did not immediately name. "Thank you," she said. "You will need light for working in the evenings," he said. "I have extra lamp oil." She unpacked her things that afternoon while he was out with the cattle, and she spread her survey notebooks on the small table and her personal books on the shelf beside them, and hung her spare rifle on the wall hook, and looked at the room and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was somewhere rather than somewhere in between. The days that followed were an education in a different kind of mapping. She finished the county survey, which she filed with Fenn in a formal report that was thorough enough to be essentially unchallengeable. She used the trust document and the corrected survey data to prepare a legal brief, not because she was a lawyer, but because she could organize an argument and she had spent 2 years learning to build an airtight case. She sent it to Vernon's contact, the land commissioner in Cheyenne, a man named Samuel Beaumont, along with a separate personal letter laying out the Voss situation and the fraudulent affidavit. Beaumont wrote back within a week, which was fast for 1882, suggesting he took it seriously. He confirmed that a fraudulent affidavit submitted to a territorial court proceeding was indeed a federal matter under the land fraud statutes of 1876, and that the survey office in Columbus was within his regulatory oversight, and that he would be initiating an inquiry. He also confirmed that he had reviewed the survey brief she prepared and found it professional and legally sound. While she was doing all of this, she was also learning the ranch. Not because she was obligated to, but because she was constitutionally incapable of being in a place without understanding it, and the Bristol Ranch was genuinely interesting land. The Redbone Creek Basin had a particular hydrological pattern that she had begun to see as something worth documenting properly, not just for legal purposes but for agricultural ones. The spring flooding pattern, if properly managed with a simple diversion channel, would make the lower pasture arable year-round instead of only in dry months. She mentioned this to Vernon over dinner one evening, with a sketch she had made in her notebook. He looked at the sketch for a long time. "This would work," he said. "It would require about 2 weeks of digging," she said. 3 people. "I have a man coming back from Fall Drive next week," he said. "Elias. He has been with the ranch for 8 years. Between the 3 of us, we could manage it before the ground freezes hard." She looked up at him across the dinner table. The firelight was on his face, and he was still looking at her sketch with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, and she had a moment of very clear perception that she had not been prepared for. He was not humoring her. He was not nodding politely at a woman's idea while privately dismissing it. He was genuinely planning, measuring the idea against his knowledge of the land and finding it solid. "You take this seriously," she said, meaning the survey work, meaning her work. He looked up. "I take accurate information seriously," he said. "Especially about this land. This land is everything." He paused. "Why would I not?" "Most men would not," she said, not bitterly, just factually. He was quiet for a moment. "Most men are losing cattle and watching their pastures fail because they cannot read their own land," he said. "I am not interested in being most men." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire burned and the Wyoming wind moved around the outside of the house, and somewhere out in the dark Prudence made a small sound in the stable. And Celia Callahan felt the particular and unsettling sensation of the ground shifting under a very carefully maintained position. The diversion channel was a good idea, she said finally, because she needed to say something grounded. It was an excellent idea, he said, and went back to reading the sketch. Elias arrived the following week. He was a compact, weathered man of about 45, with a straight back and quiet manner, and he accepted Celia's presence on the ranch and her marriage to Vernon with the same equanimity that Joseph Runsfar had shown, the equanimity of a person who had seen enough of the world to understand that it did not always arrange itself according to social expectation, and who did not require it to. He was also an excellent worker. The three of them began the diversion channel project on a Tuesday morning, and Celia directed the line of the channel using her surveying equipment to establish the correct grade for water flow, and Elias and Vernon dug with methodical, sustained effort, and by Friday afternoon they had something that functioned. They released the temporary diversion and stood in a line watching the creek water take the new channel, and it moved cleanly and correctly down the grade she had calculated, and the lower pasture, which had been waterlogged and half useless, began to drain. Vernon stood next to her watching the water move, and she felt him turn to look at her, and she did not look back immediately, watching the channel do what she had said it would do with the particular satisfaction of applied precision. "I did not think it would work that fast," he said. "The grade is steep enough," she said. "I calculated for the October flow rate. It will need a slight adjustment in spring when the snowmelt comes, but by then the channel banks will be established and we can redirect easily." He was quiet for a moment. "Celia," he said. She turned to look at him. "I do not think I have ever met anyone like you," he said, straight, clean, no artifice. She looked at him for a moment in which several things happened internally that she was not yet ready to discuss with anyone, including herself. "That may be because there are not many of us," she said. He smiled, a real smile, not careful or measured, just a smile, and it changed his face completely, and she stored that image in the same precise internal catalog where she kept the data that mattered. The court date approached. The Sunday before the November 15th proceedings, Celia received a telegraph from Commissioner Beaumont in Cheyenne. The inquiry into Voss had been formalized. The fraudulent affidavit submitted to Dusthaven County Court had been flagged as inadmissible, and Prescott had been officially notified. More significantly, the USGS inquiry had located 3 other field workers, 2 men and another woman, who had similar documentation of Voss's appropriation of their work. The inquiry was now an investigation, and the survey director had been placed on administrative review. She sat with the telegraph at the kitchen table and read it twice, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 years, a wire of anger and injustice and accumulated wrongness that had been keeping her spine straight through sheer tension. Vernon came in from the stable and saw her at the table and said nothing, waiting. She handed him the telegraph. He read it. He looked at her. "It is not over," he said, "but it is turning." "Yes," she said. "How do you feel?" She considered the question carefully. She was not accustomed to being asked how she felt by someone who actually wanted to know. "Like I can stop running," she said, and the words surprised her with their accuracy. He sat down across from her, not speaking, just there, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and outside the November wind was building toward what would be the first real storm of winter, and she was aware with a precision she would not have described to anyone that she did not want to be anywhere else. "Vernon," she said. "Yes. I want to say something." He waited. "When I agreed to this arrangement," she said, "I was entirely strategic in my thinking. I want you to know that because I have always been honest with you and I am not going to stop now. I calculated the advantages and I made a rational decision." "I know," he said. "So did I." "Now," she said, and stopped and started again. "And now I find that I am not primarily strategic in my thinking when it concerns you, which is new, which I am still mapping, if you will forgive the metaphor." He looked at her for a long moment, and his face was open in a way that she understood required something from him, because he was a private man and this kind of openness was not effortless. "I have been in love with you," he said. since you told me the benchmarks did not actually move." She looked at him. That was the second conversation we had. "I know," he said. "I was surprised too," she laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a social laugh. It was a real one, from somewhere she had not opened in a long time, and the sound of it in the kitchen seemed to surprise both of them. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers on the telegraph paper. His hand was warm and very steady, the hand of a man who drove fence posts and built ranch fences and had spent 4 years doing hard physical work alone, and it was also the hand of a man who had looked at her work with genuine recognition. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, which was enough for now. There would be more words later. There would be time. The courthouse proceedings on November 15th were considerably less dramatic than anyone had expected, which was the nature of things when the legal groundwork was properly laid. Prescott arrived with his Harlan Greer and his Cheyenne lawyer confidence, and was met with the certified survey results, the trust document, the recorded marriage, and the formal notification from Commissioner Beaumont's office that the fraudulent affidavit was inadmissible, and that an investigation into the party who submitted it was active. The county judge, a man named Alderman Hoyt who had been on the Dusthaven bench for 12 years, examined the survey results first. He was a methodical man, and he went through the figures with the particular attention of someone who had spent 12 years sorting out land disputes in a territory where most of the original surveys were optimistic at best and dishonest at worst. He asked Celia several questions about the methodology, precise technical questions that she answered precisely and technically, and she watched his respect for the work build in real time in the quality of his listening. He denied Harlan Greer's contestation on 3 separate grounds. The survey was accurate and established the parcel at over 800 acres. The marital restriction was satisfied by the recorded marriage, and the trust instrument filed by James Bristol in 1874 provided a secondary and independent legal basis for Vernon's ownership that predated the contestation by 8 years. Harlan Greer's face went through several changes during this reading, none of them becoming. His lawyer was already calculating the cost of an appeal and the probability of its success, and his calculations were visible in his expression. Vernon stood beside Celia during the reading and did not move, did not show anything outwardly, but she felt his hand find hers under the edge of the table at the moment Judge Hoyt said denied, and she held it. Outside the courthouse afterward in the sharp November light, Harlan made one last attempt. He came to Vernon in the street and said, with the bitterness of a man who has lost and cannot accept it gracefully, that the marriage was a convenience and everyone knew it, that he would take it to territorial court, that he had not finished. Vernon looked at him. "Harlan," he said, "I have never wished you harm. I have watched you turn a family dispute into something uglier than it needed to be, and I am sorry for that, not for myself, but for what it has cost you. This is done. You should go home." Harlan looked at Celia. He said something that was cruel in the specific way that men who have lost to a woman are sometimes cruel, something about her credentials and her running and her hidden motives, and he said it loud enough to be heard. Celia looked at him calmly. She had faced worse. She had faced the erasure of her entire professional identity by a man with institutional power, and she had navigated it, and she was still standing in the high Wyoming sun with her credentials intact and her work on record with the territorial court. Harlan Greer with his losing argument and his expensive lawyer was not, in the final accounting, her most significant obstacle. "Your cousin's land was properly surveyed and properly claimed," she said. "The water rights are established. The trust is valid. There is nothing left for you here, Mr. Greer. I suggest you find something of your own to build." He looked at her for a moment, and then he walked away, and he kept walking, and he left Dusthaven the following week, which they heard from Joseph, and he did not come back. The winter that followed was the best and the hardest thing she had experienced. Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1882 into 1883 was not gentle with anyone. The November storm that had been building the night she held Vernon's hand over the telegraph broke into a blizzard that lasted 5 days and dropped 4 feet of snow across the basin. The cattle had to be moved, the water supply managed, the woodpile supplemented from the timber stand on the northern corner of the property, and there were mornings when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and everything that could freeze tried to. She worked alongside Vernon and Elias through all of it, not because she was expected to, but because it was her land now too. Legally and increasingly in some deeper sense, she was still working out the language for. She managed the water supply calculation, figuring the freeze depth against the well casing and monitoring the diversion channel, which held its banks through the first major thaw in late January beautifully. She helped bring in cattle on horseback in conditions that would have turned back many people, because she could navigate in low visibility using her compass and her knowledge of the terrain, and because Prudence was a horse of exceptional intelligence who trusted her judgment in the dark. There was a night in February when they were bringing in 3 strays from the far eastern pasture, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour in a way that even experienced Wyoming hands described as unusual, and the wind came up with it, and visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Elias had already turned back with the main group. Vernon was about 40 yards from her when the whiteout hit, and she could not see him. She did not panic. She oriented on the last position she had seen him, triangulated against the wind direction and the slope of the land which she had memorized, and moved toward where she calculated he would be. She found him in 3 minutes, which was not luck, it was method, and when she materialized out of the white dark beside him, he grabbed her arm and said, "How did you know where I was?" She told him briefly, in the way of someone who does not have time to be detailed because they need to get 2 people and their horses back to a warm barn. He looked at her through the blowing snow with an expression she could not fully read in those conditions, but she felt it, the quality of his attention on her face, and she filed it alongside the other things she was building a catalog of. They made it back. In the barn, with the horses settled and the lantern burning and both of them shaking slightly with the cold coming off them in waves, he said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered." She was unwinding her scarf from her face. "I just know the land," she said. "You knew it in a whiteout in February," he said, "in conditions you had never been in before." "I mapped it," she said simply. He crossed the space between them and kissed her. Not briefly or formally this time, nothing like the courthouse ceremony. This was a different thing entirely, warm and real and specific to who they actually were, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything she did, and the cold went away very fast. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in the high country, and with it, a kind of settling into something that was neither the arrangement they had begun with nor a performance of what they thought it should look like, but something that had grown in the space between 2 honest people who had stopped pretending. The Voss investigation resolved in March of 1883. Commissioner Beaumont sent a formal letter to Vernon's address, because Celia had listed it as her legal address when she filed with the county in October, and the letter was addressed to Celia Callahan Bristol, which made her sit with the hyphen for a moment, a small thing that carried weight. The letter confirmed that the USGS investigation had concluded, that Voss had been dismissed from the survey and faced federal charges for fraudulent appropriation of government research under his employees' names, that all work produced during his tenure would be re-examined and reattributed, and that Celia's specific field survey of the Green River Basin had been officially reattributed to her by name in the survey records, with a formal letter of apology from the acting director. She read the letter at the kitchen table in the spring morning light, and Vernon watched her read it. She set it down when she was done and was quiet for a moment. "It is over," he said. "It is over," she said. He got up and filled her coffee cup, because that was how he expressed things he did not always have words for, through small, precise actions, and she had learned to read him as accurately as she read land, and she understood what the full cup meant. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne sent a separate inquiry, she said, asking if I would be willing to take a formal survey contract for the Green River Basin reassessment. They want someone who knows the original data. He sat down. He looked at her. That would take you away for months. Yes, she said, it would. He was quiet. She could see him measuring the space between what he wanted, which was her here, and what he believed, which was that her work was real and necessary and not something she should sacrifice for anyone's comfort, including his. When do they need an answer? He said. By April, she said. It is a significant opportunity, he said. Yes, she said. And the Redbone Creek Basin survey you started last fall, he said, is only half finished. She looked at him. I know. It is important documentation for the property, he said, and his voice was carefully level, and she loved him very much in that moment, loved the careful levelness of his voice, the way he was trying to make space for her without making it easy to leave. But it could wait, theoretically. It could wait, she said, or it could be completed this spring, in the remaining months before the Green River contract would start, if the survey work goes efficiently. He held her gaze. Are you telling me you are planning to do both? I am telling you I am considering it, she said, and that if I took the Green River contract I would be coming back. This is my land now too. You told me so yourself. Something moved across his face, warm and unguarded. Yes, he said, it is. Then I am not running, she said. I am working. There is a difference. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Outside, the first real spring morning of 1883 was happening, the creek running high with snowmelt, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the Redbone Creek Basin spreading out under a sky that was the particular sharp blue that belongs exclusively to high country in April, a blue that made even a practical, scientific woman feel that the world had opinions about how beautiful it could be. She completed the Redbone Creek Basin survey in May and June, the most thorough hydrological and land survey of the basin that had ever been conducted, which was later entered into the Territorial Land Office records and became the standard reference document for the region for the next 20 years. She annotated it with the creek channel migration data, the soil composition analysis, the water table depth measurements across seasons, and a set of predictions about where the basin would need managed intervention in the next decade to remain agriculturally productive. The survey was filed under her name, Celia Callahan Bristol, certified surveyor, and the hyphen felt more like a choice than an attachment. She also sat for the Wyoming Territorial Survey certification in May, a formal examination that had recently been opened to women following the territory's early female suffrage legislation, and she passed it with the highest score recorded that year, which she did not mention but which Elias found out from the clerk and told Vernon, who did not mention it either but was seen smiling privately at odd moments for the following week. She left for the Green River Basin in early July with Prudence and a new surveying kit that Vernon had purchased through a Denver supplier in May, an upgrade from her previous kit with a transit level that was 2 full generations more accurate. She had not asked for it. She found it on the kitchen table one morning with a note that said, in Vernon's plain handwriting, "For the Green River work. Come back to us." She understood the plural as an expression of how he thought about the ranch, the land, the life they were building. She returned in October, exactly 1 year after she had first ridden into Dusthaven covered in trail dust with a fast horse and no intention of stopping. The Green River survey had been excellent work, the kind of work she had always known she could do, and it would be published with her name on every page, and that fact sat in her chest with a clean, settled weight that she understood was not triumph so much as restoration. Vernon was at the fence line when she rode up to the ranch, which was where she had first found him, and which she thought later was either coincidence or the particular poetic logic of good land. He heard Prudence coming and turned, and when he saw her he set down the fence tool and came toward her without running, at the pace of a man who has waited a long time and has learned patience without losing urgency, and she dismounted while he was still 20 yards away and met him the rest of the distance. He held her for a moment with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and neither of them said anything, because some arrivals do not require words. "The Green River data," she said, eventually into his shoulder because she was who she was. "It confirmed some of what I suspected about the snowmelt patterns. I want to show you the charts." He laughed warm and real against her hair. "Tonight," he said. "Show me tonight. Come inside first." She went inside. The kitchen table had her notebooks exactly where she had left them. The bookshelf had a new volume in the gap she had left when she packed, a geology text she had mentioned wanting in March. The lamp oil was full. The house was maintained to the same standard she had brought to it, which was the standard of someone who cared about the place. "You fixed the north pasture fence," she said, having noticed it on the way in. "Elias and I, early September," he said. "The diversion channel held through the summer flood perfectly, exactly as you said." She sat at the table and looked at him across the kitchen, and he looked back at her, and it was the easiest thing she had ever seen, the ease of two people who have worked out how to be honest with each other. "I'm not going to keep running," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I may travel for contracts. The work I do requires going to the land, but this is where I am. This is the place I stopped." He sat across from her. "I know," he said. "I want us to be very clear about things," she said. "I always want us to be clear." "I know that too," he said. "So I am telling you directly," she said, "that what I feel for you is not part of the arrangement we made. It is separate from it and larger than it, and it is not going away." He held her gaze with those gray eyes that she had been reading for a year and could still find new things in. "Celia," he said, "I love you." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I know I love you too. I have been figuring out how to say it plainly, and it turns out the plain version is quite short." He smiled. She smiled back. The October wind, exactly as it had been a year ago, moved around the outside of the house, and this time it felt like the punctuation at the end of a sentence rather than the beginning of an uncertainty. They were married in the proper sense of their own understanding of it that winter, which was not the legal ceremony in October of the previous year, but a quieter and more real thing, a choosing of each other without any legal architecture required, happening in the accumulated evidence of daily life. The way he waited to start dinner until she came in from working, regardless of how late it got. The way she planned survey work around the ranching calendar, because it mattered to her that the ranch thrived. The way they talked, late in the evenings, about everything from hydrology to Dickens, to the particular political situation in the territory, to the small specific things that made up the texture of their days. In the spring of 1884, Celia missed the signs for a while because she was focusing on a sub-basin survey for a neighboring county, and because she had never paid close attention to such things. It was Elias who finally mentioned, with the tactful indirection of someone who is being as tactful as the situation allows, that she might want to speak with the doctor in Dusthaven before she went on the next field survey. She spoke with the doctor, Dr. Margaret Fairweather, who had come to Dusthaven from St. Louis, and ran the town's only medical practice with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made a decision to be useful in a place that needed her, confirmed what the signs had been suggesting. Celia sat in the doctor's office for a moment in the particular stunned stillness of someone whose extremely orderly internal mapping system has just encountered something entirely new. She rode back to the ranch and found Vernon in the south pasture with the cattle, and she dismounted and walked to him and said, simply and directly, as was her practice, "We are going to have a child. In November." He stood very still. Then he said very quietly, "November." "The doctor says November," she said. "Specifically, she says mid to late November." He looked at her with an expression she did not have survey notation for, something that was too many things at once, the kind of complex layered feeling that lives outside of categorization, and she filed it under important and let it be what it was. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling entirely fine," she said. Dr. Fairweather says I am healthy and that there is no reason I cannot continue field work for at least another 4 months if I am careful about the physical demands. Of course, he said. And then, very carefully, Celia. Is this what you want? She looked at him. The question, the way he asked it without assuming her answer, without flattening her into a role she had not chosen, was so specifically and exactly him that she felt the fullness of it like a physical thing. Yes, she said, it is very much what I want. He put his arms around her in the south pasture with the cattle looking on and the Wyoming spring sun on both of them, and she felt his hands very carefully and deliberately on her back, as though she were something extraordinarily valuable that he was also not going to treat as fragile, because he knew her, and he held her the way a man holds someone he knows and loves rather than a category he has invented. She completed the sub-basin survey in June and spent July and August at the ranch, not because she had been told to rest, but because she chose to, finding that there was a great deal of interesting work to be done in the documentation of the ranch's own hydrology that she had been meaning to undertake properly and had kept deferring. The ranch survey she had promised Vernon in their first arrangement became, that summer, one of the most detailed single-property surveys in the territory, annotated with seasonal water data, soil composition profiles, grazing zone assessments, and a set of drainage improvement recommendations that she and Vernon and Elias spent 3 weeks implementing. It was good work. She was good at it, and the particular quality of doing it alongside the man she loved on the land they shared together was a satisfaction that she had not had a map for, because it was the kind of thing that cannot be surveyed in advance, only discovered by being in it. Their son was born on the 19th of November, 1884, which was a cold, clear day with frost on the windows and the creek running low in the way it did in late autumn. Dr. Fairweather attended. Elias made himself useful in the barn by doing things that did not need doing, in the way of a man who cares deeply and has nowhere to put it. Vernon stayed. She had not asked him to, but he did not consider leaving. He was there with the quiet, present steadiness that was his characteristic mode, and when it was done and she was lying in the bed with a blanket and a new person, a small, emphatic, apparently very annoyed person who had strong opinions about being cold, he sat beside her and looked at the baby with the same expression he had turned on the south pasture in the spring, the one outside categorization. He looks furious, Vernon said. He will settle, she said. She thought he would. She was not certain. She had not surveyed this territory. What should we call him? Vernon asked. She had thought about this. James, she said. After your father, if you are willing. He looked at her. His face in the lamplight was so open that it almost hurt to look at it. James, he said. James Vernon Bristol, she said. Unless you want something else. No, he said very quietly. That is exactly right. James Vernon Bristol turned out to be a child with emphatic opinions, a strong constitution, and a quality of focused attention that both of his parents recognized immediately. He did not, as it turned out, like to be where he was expected to be, which Celia noted with the scientific detachment of a woman who could see a family trait emerging in real time. He was mobile extremely early, which was both impressive and logistically challenging. Vernon discovered that the baby had developed the capacity to pull himself to standing against the fence rail of the lower paddock at 9 months, which he reported to Celia with an expression that mixed parental pride with very genuine alarm. Elias built a gate for the paddock entrance that same afternoon. The ranch grew. Not recklessly, but steadily, with the methodical expansion of people who understood what land could support and were not interested in taking more than that. Celia's reputation as a surveyor expanded in the same pattern. The Green River publication was widely cited. Her Redbone Creek Basin survey became the reference document she had intended it to be. And in 1886, she received an offer of a permanent consulting position with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne that would allow her to work primarily from Dusthaven on field projects. She accepted it, and for the next several years she was the most frequently cited survey authority in Wyoming Territory, a fact that the acting director of the USGS in Washington eventually wrote to formally acknowledge, in a letter that was the institutional equivalent of a long-delayed apology, which she accepted with a graciousness that she felt was precisely calibrated. The Voss prosecution resolved in 1885. He was convicted of federal fraud charges, fined heavily, and barred from federal employment, a resolution that was not everything but was considerably more than she had been promised when she first sat at a director's desk in Columbus and was told that there was nothing to be done. The other field workers whose work he had taken also received formal reattribution. The woman among them, a geologist named Ruth Hartley who had been working in Colorado, wrote Celia a letter that she kept. In the summer of 1887, James was 2.5 years old and had recently become very interested in the surveying kit, specifically in the transit level, which he viewed as something to look through at things. And Celia had been teaching him, with entirely appropriate 3-year-old modifications, how to identify where north was using a compass, which he was surprisingly competent at. She was pregnant again in the spring of 1887, which she discovered with rather more rapid recognition than the first time, and which she told Vernon one evening after dinner with the directness that was still her mode, sitting across the kitchen table with her notebooks open in front of her. He looked at her for a moment in which the same complex, outside categorization expression appeared. Then he said, "James is going to be a very interested big brother." "He is going to be insufferable," she said affectionately. "He is going to be magnificent," Vernon said. She had a daughter that December, which was a full week before Dr. Fairweather's estimate, a piece of scheduling that Celia noted as a statistical outlier and accepted philosophically. They named her Margaret Elias Bristol, the first name for Dr. Fairweather, who had earned it twice over, the middle name for Elias, who had been part of the ranch and their life long enough to have earned a place in the naming of things. Elias, when informed of the middle name, went out to the paddock and did not come back for 20 minutes, and when he came back his eyes were red, which everyone had the decency not to notice. Margaret was quieter than James and considerably more observant, with dark eyes that seemed to be measuring things from the first week of her life, and which she directed at Celia with a focused interest that suggested she had inherited something specific. James was, as Celia had predicted, insufferable in the most loving and enthusiastic possible way, about having a smaller person to show things to. The Bristol Ranch in the late 1880s was one of the best-run properties in Dusthaven County, not the largest, not the wealthiest in terms of cattle numbers, but managed with a precision that made it consistently productive year over year in conditions that ruined less carefully managed operations. The diversion channel held. The pasture rotation that Celia had planned and Vernon had implemented kept the grazing land in good health. The water rights were documented and defended through 2 subsequent attempts by neighboring landholders to contest them, and both attempts failed on the strength of Celia's original survey documentation. Harlan Greer had never come back. They heard occasionally, through the loose information network of frontier territories, that he had gone to Colorado and then to Arizona and was doing something in mining. He had not prospered particularly, but neither had he come to harm, and Celia, who was not a vindictive woman, found this to be a satisfactory resolution. Joseph Runsfar continued to run the livery in Dusthaven until 1889, when he retired and handed it to his son, and he came to the ranch for a celebratory dinner on what the Bristols had begun to call Deed Day, the anniversary of the November 15th court decision, every year that he was able. He had known, he told Celia one of those evenings, sitting at the kitchen table while James attempted to explain compass navigation to Margaret in the next room, that she would be what the land needed. "The land needs people who listen to it," he said. "You listen." She thought about that. "Vernon listens too," she said. "Yes," Joseph said. That is why it works." Vernon, across the table, met her eyes, and the quality of that exchange was the quality of a long marriage between two specific people. It carried all the conversations, and all the seasons, and all the work, and all the particular weather of loving someone who is genuinely themselves. In the fall of 1889, Wyoming achieved statehood, and with statehood came a formal state survey office, and the first state surveyor general was appointed. Celia was offered the position. She considered it for 3 weeks, which was the most time she had ever taken to make a professional decision, because the consideration was not purely professional. The position was based in Cheyenne, which was not Dusthaven. The position would require significant time away from the ranch, from the children, from Vernon. She talked to him about it as she talked to him about everything at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were asleep, without romanticizing the choice or making it easier than it was. "You should take it," he said. "I want to hear what you actually think," she said, "not the version designed to support what you think I want." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is the right position for you professionally. I think the survey office needs someone who will build it correctly, and you will build it correctly. I think James is old enough that my being here more is manageable, and Elias is part of this family and he will not leave. I think the ranch can sustain 3 or 4 months a year of your absence without significant difficulty, because we know what we are doing now. And I think," he said steadily, "that the woman I love is someone whose work matters and whose work will matter more if it is done from that position than from a field contract basis. So yes, I think you should take it." She looked at him for a long time. "I am going to take it," she said. "And I am going to spend December through February in Dusthaven without exception. Those are my terms." "Your terms are excellent," he said. She became the first Wyoming State Surveyor General in December of 1889, and she served in that position for 6 years, building the state survey office from a piece of legislation into a functioning institution with consistent standards, trained personnel, and a documentation system that would serve the state for decades. She hired women when they were qualified, which they often were and which made some people in Cheyenne uncomfortable, and she handled that discomfort with the same calm, documented precision she brought to everything. She came home to the ranch for December through February every year without exception, and those months were a particular quality of time, dense and warm, the kitchen full and the children loud and Vernon steady at the center of all of it. The same man she had first seen driving fence posts in the far eastern pasture, now with silver beginning at his temples and more lines around his eyes, and exactly the same quality of attention and care. James grew into a young man of considerable intelligence and very firm opinions, who was genuinely interested in both ranching and cartography, and who was extremely good at both, and who had a habit of spending summers mapping the surrounding territory with his mother's old surveying kit in ways that produced results of actual professional quality by the time he was 16. Vernon watched this development with the particular satisfaction of a parent who has given a child a great gift by simply being who they were, and Celia watched it with the scientific appreciation of someone observing a methodology successfully transmitted. Margaret was quieter and more interior, and by 14 was demonstrably the better reader of the two children, and by 16 was in correspondence with Dr. Fairweather about the possibility of medical training in Denver, and by 18 was enrolled in the Colorado College of Medicine with the unequivocal support of both parents and the slightly terrifying focused determination that she had apparently always had, looking at things with those measuring eyes. Celia served her 6 years as Surveyor General and then stepped down, not from defeat or pressure, but from the clear-eyed recognition that the office was now functioning properly and needed new leadership with new vision, which was how good institutions worked. And she returned to Dusthaven and to the ranch and to field consulting work, which was where her genuine pleasure in the work lived, and to the particular pleasure of being home. Vernon was at the fence line when she came back, because that was how this story seemed to arrange itself, and he turned when he heard Prudence, though Prudence was very old now and moved more slowly, and he came to meet her. She was 41 years old. He was 43. The basin behind him was green in the spring light, the creek running clearly in the channel that had moved naturally eastward a few more feet in the 20-something years since she had first mapped it, and which she had noted in her survey notes with the satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. The ranch was in excellent order. The fences were good. The cattle were well. The house was full of books and notebooks, and the particular organized chaos of a family that reads and thinks and argues productively. She dismounted, as she had done at 27, and walked toward him, as she had done at 27, and he came to meet her, and the quality of meeting now was different from how it had been. It was deeper and more layered, like a survey conducted over many seasons, every pass adding new data to a picture that was already good but kept getting more complete. He held her face in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him. "How was Cheyenne?" he said. "Cheyenne was good work," she said. "Done, how is the ranch?" "The south pasture is excellent," he said. "James's channel adjustment in February worked. He has your eye." "He has good training," she said. "He has your brain," Vernon said, "and my stubbornness. It is a remarkable combination." She laughed, the real laugh, from the place she had opened in this kitchen years ago and had not closed since. "Remarkable is one word for it," she said. He kissed her in the yard in the spring morning properly, the way he had kissed her in the barn during the February blizzard 10 years before, and around them the ranch was alive and functional, and theirs, hers and his and the children's, built from a forced choice and a business arrangement, and two honest people who had looked at each other and decided to see what was true. She had come west running and had found, not refuge exactly, not hiding, but ground, real ground. 831 acres of it, accurately measured, every boundary documented and defended, the water rights established, the soil understood, the seasonal patterns mapped in 4 decades of survey notebooks that lived on the shelves of the study beside Vernon's ranching manuals and the Dickens, and the geological handbook she had first noticed when she walked into this house for the very first time. She was not running anymore. She was exactly where the land had always been, where the benchmarks were fixed and the channel moved and the water was real, and the man she loved was standing in the April sunlight looking at her with gray eyes that had always seen her clearly. From the first time she rode up to a fence line with surveying equipment and a practical question, and a dark past she was in the process of resolving. That past was resolved. The future was the ranch and the work and the children who were already out in the world doing things that mattered, and the man who had never once asked her to be smaller, and the land that she understood the way she understood almost nothing else, in its true and accurate dimensions, every acre of it accounted for, every boundary known. Celia Callahan Bristol stopped running in 1882 in a county called Dusthaven in Wyoming Territory, on 831 acres of creek land with a corrected deed, and a documented water right, and a husband who thought the elevation profiles in the Green River Basin Survey were extraordinary. And he was right, they were, and so was she, and so was the life they built together on the honest ground of knowing each other truly. The creek still runs east of where it was in 1869. The diversion channel still holds, the benchmarks are permanent. And in the land office in Cheyenne, in the bound volumes of the Wyoming Territorial and State Survey records, the name on the Redbone Creek Basin Survey is exactly the name it should be. The name of the woman who read the land truly and who found, in the process, that some things cannot be surveyed in advance, but only discovered by staying long enough to see what they actually are.